Good afternoon and welcome to the 19th Century Charitable Association in Oak Park, where it is our vision to be a dynamic cultural center for community learning. I'm Deb Hammond, the co-director of programs and the literature chair. Our 30 seasons this season of our enrichment series are part of our mission to strengthen our community through learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. Today's program is Suffrage Song, the haunted history of gender, race, and voting rights in America, a very apt topic for these days. I'm very pleased to introduce a River Forest native, Caitlin Cass. She is an author, an illustrator, an assistant professor of studio art, illustration, time-based media, I'm not sure what that is, at the University of Nebraska. This is the first graphic book that literature has featured, and the topic seemed so perfect for us. The author is a cartoonist and installation artist who makes work about systemic failure and irrational hope. She self-publishes a bimonthly comic periodical called Great Moments in Western Civilization Postal Constituent.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure to just join you for lunch and to realize that I'm eating off of the china that some women who fought for suffrage may have eaten off at some point. It's just such a moving thing to me because women's clubs across the country had such a huge involvement in making the suffrage movement happen and work. So it's cool to be at a place like this to give a talk. So I'm here to talk about Suffrage Song. I'll also talk a little bit about some new projects at the end of the talk. This book came out last summer in June, and we've had kind of a wild ride since then. So it's interesting to think about the ways this book has already kind of changed and transformed with this political moment. The book covers the history of the women's suffrage movement from 1848, and then it sort of reworks the periodization of this history to include women who fought during the civil rights movement as well. So it goes all the way up to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I think it's really interesting and important to look at those histories side by side because the push for educated suffrage instead of just universal suffrage, that transition that happened in the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, I think rhymes in a little bit of an upsetting way with the literacy tests that were used across the South. I'm going to read the short excerpt first to give you some context about why the book is called Suffrage Song. So all those sentimental songs. Music was part of the fight for women's rights from the beginning. Suffrage sheet music was sold at conventions to raise money. Suffrage songs built communal feeling at meetings and gave attendees a way to be involved. Our country now from thee claim we our liberty. The songs themselves often suffered from the same platitudes and stereotypes that were found in women's magazines and sentimental literature of the day. Guarding home's altar fires, daughters of patriot sires, their zeal our own inspires, justice to claim. They reinforced what historian Barbara Welter later dubbed the cult of true womanhood. A true woman embodied piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. And that's her writing about the history in 1966. So she wasn't saying that in 1966. Of course, the songs occasionally hammered at one of these pillars. I don't, and I can't, and I won't, and I shan't. I will speak my mind if I die for it. So what I was interested in is the way these songs were very important in creating this communal feeling at these rallies, but at the same time, they fell short in many ways. But they still had that power to create the unity that was necessary to push the movement forward. So by using that title, I hope to invoke that. Like I know that anytime someone writes a history, it's going to have some bias to it. So it was comforting to me to take that title on. And then also, of course, songs were used throughout the civil rights movement. So this is Fannie Lou Hamer, who famously testified about trying to register to vote and the punishment or the the violence she faced in Mississippi for trying to register. And so this is a moment in the book where she reflects on a very trying moment she had in her childhood where their farm was destroyed by a group of white supremacists. And afterwards, singing became a big healing factor in the church. Her father was a minister. So she was famous for singing for the movement and giving these speeches that were sort of like sermons that mixed her personal biography with song. So this was another reason the song, it seemed to be like a common thing that unified the movement. So this is the book, and I'm not sure if I don't think the little video will work, but there are fold-outs in the book. There's 4 maps that fold out, and my hope was that it would feel a little bit like flipping through an archive, and to try to bring in the wonder that I felt as I was doing the research. So I did do some printmaking for this project to try to evoke that, like trying to get some of the design of some of the printed materials I was looking at into the book itself. So I'm here with this is a copper plate doing some etchings at the Women's Studio Workshop in upstate New York. And in the style of Lady's Godey book. So Godey's Lady book, I said it out of order, is a fashion magazine that was popular in the mid to late 1800s and famously apolitical, or tried to be. So they didn't talk about, the readership spread north and south, and throughout the Civil War, they didn't talk about the Civil War, even though it was like very present in everybody's mind, except they did make a stance a little bit by publishing more anti-abolition than pro-abolition books, book reviews in the magazine. But it was very taboo for women to talk about politics. It just was not considered part of their sphere. And fashion was such a huge thing in a lot of these women's lives. So I created some spoof etchings on this topic. So they're saying, maybe we should end slavery. 50,000 men died at Gettysburg. Radicalism is unbecoming of a lady. And our dresses keep getting more amazing. So these women, this was what Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were dealing with. You know, oftentimes they would go to try to get a signature at somebody's house to support women's rights, and they would just have the door slammed in their face. And so it was a pretty difficult thing. These women had to have like radical imagination to even ask for the right to vote. This is an example of I made this mock-up, and before it was called Suffrage Song, it was called Suffrage Ghosts. But you can see the fold-out. I made this one by hand and hand-bound it, and then I hand-did the cover with silver ink. So this was actually what got me the book contract. We just had a verbal agreement, and I sent them this hand-bound book, and then they were like, okay, we'll give you the contract finally. So that was nice. They sent it back, too, which was nice of them. I really wanted the book to feel handmade, or to have that handmade piece. I think feminist history is handmade. It reminds me of, I grew up going to a lot of roadside history museums with Mrs. McMahon, Laurel McMahon, my neighbor, who's also part of the Historical Society, and my mom. They had like those passport programs where you would get your passport stamped at all these different little history museums in all of the little suburbs of Chicago. And I had the same feeling when I went to the Women's Hall of Fame, and I found it really moving that you could tell that this was the work of people who just spent some time like trying to celebrate these women. The posters are just like hand-mounted to foam core. A lot of them don't have glass, or it's not fancy, and they do have a much fancier building now. But when I went there at the beginning of this project, they were still in this downtown, small little location with all of these different women being represented on the walls, and I found it really inspiring. And similarly, I was thinking about Judy Chicago's dinner party piece. So this is at the Brooklyn Museum now. But she's credited as the main artist, but she worked with many different women, fiber artists and ceramicists to create this. And there's a place setting for a bunch of different women from history at the table, and then more names are written on the floor. And these women found, that they hadn't learned about any of these women in their education. And so they came together, they worked with historians to learn as much as they could, and then they made these very elaborate handmade place settings for each of the women, which I just find so touching. You can see the hand there, you can see the effort that goes into that history. I feel like these kinds of statues are not so handmade. Like the hand has been edited out, right? It looks very monumental and extreme. This was created during the Jim Crow era, long after the Civil War had ended, in part to raise the property values on Monument Avenue there in Richmond, Virginia. And, Robert E. Lee, I think, even famously said he didn't want any monuments to himself. So there's that, too, if you want to respect his ideas. But I do think that this is handmade history, right? Bringing that monument down. And every night when they would scrub some of these off, people would come back and do it again, and they would have these picnics surrounding these monuments to sort of take this history back. And I found that really powerful, and this was happening while I was doing the project. So it was all very much in it for me. And I wanted it to be handmade. I, for a long time, have made a postal constituent that I mail out to people 6 times a year. And the format changes every month. So I wanted to kind of keep that in the project. I was working, before this, I was making a lot of work that satirized and made fun at failure throughout history, mostly making fun of dead white guys. And I was teaching at an all-girls school. And so slowly it became more important to me to represent more diverse histories. And that's how I came upon the project. And then I also was working with a gallery in Buffalo, New York, the Birchfield Penny Art Center, and the curator had subscribed to my comics. And so there was grant funding available for the Suffrage Centennial, and he reached out to me. And so that was how the project began. I always like to mention that because for the suffrage movement and for any activist movement, money is everything, right? Like a lot of things don't happen without a little impetus. So I think it's important to acknowledge that and also thank the Birchfield Penny Art Center for getting me started. But of course, I just kept going after that. And you could see kind of the influence of my life in the comic too. So this is Susan B. Anthony, but she also sold pamphlets. This is after one of her visits to an area church as she was traveling all over New York State to try to get the Women's Property Act passed so that women would have the right to own property, which was of course then later revoked during the Civil War. But to give you a little bit more context, so when I was a kid, I was part of the Forest Home Cemetery walk every year, starting when I was 7. So this is going to come back briefly at the end. But you can see on the left, I'm 7, and I was playing an Iroquois theater fire victim. That's the fire downtown that broke out during the holidays, and as everyone rushed back to the exit doors, they found out that they open inward, and since there was such a big crowd, they couldn't get out. So many of them passed away in piles in front of the exits. And I told this story to adults, and they cried. And as a 7-year-old, I was like, wow, that is power, That's exciting. On the right, I'm playing Elizabeth Porter Furback and talking about her pioneer days, but of course, did not really mention, her complicity in colonialism. But it's still, mostly I played disaster victims. I'm going to talk about that more later, but it was very influential. First byline with my friend Fiona, and I actually think Laurel McMahon might have helped us write this a little bit, but we wrote for the American Girl News just about what it was like to play these historical figures in the cemetery walk. And then, and I was a little bummed because it wasn't the cool American Girl. Like this was the cool American Girl where they taught you about braids and hosting peppermint parties. This was like a little nerdier. This was like you would send in your photos about your American Girl dolls. But if you look closely, this is the original version of the magazine. It says that it's the newspaper of the American Girls Club and historical society. And that was super exciting to me. I wanted to be part of a historical society as a kid. Of course, it was more like a brand magazine. It was like early social media for the brand. So I was always a little disappointed by it. And you can see I had like just started puberty in this picture. Fiona still hadn't. And I was like a little embarrassed about being in the American Girl News. But now I'm taking it back. I feel like I should be proud. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about why there are ghosts in the book as well. So the book, this is not like fully in order, so I won't do the straight reading. But this history was written for ghosts. The ghosts they embody an anxiety of existing in a broken system. They represent like the history that still needs to be reckoned with and the history that remains unwritten. When I started the project in 2019, I was really kind of working through dread a little bit because I wasn't sure how to tackle the racism within the suffrage movement. I had a lot of anxiety about it, and I kind of had resisted calling some of these women racist for fear that that would like cancel them or something or negate all of the good they did. I felt shame that my ancestors had voting privileges while many people did not, and this made me revert, I think, to absolutes, as if a person can't be both good and bad at the same time. Which, of course, we all recognize that to some degree in the history of white men, but we have a harder time recognizing that when it's somebody who's also faced some sort of oppression. And so I struggled to hold the good white suffragists did in my head alongside the damage they caused. It was easier to focus on the bad, but that wasn't the whole story. So here's Carrie Chapman Catt, and she's saying, I'll say whatever racist thing it takes to get white women the vote. So she was a particularly upsetting offender to me. Because in the South, when she was campaigning for the vote, she would say that women voting would help uphold white supremacy. And in the North, when she was campaigning for the vote, she would talk about how everybody should be able to vote, that it was really important and an educational thing that everyone should have access to. And she also believed a lot of social Darwinist ideas. And so I wasn't sure how to confront that. But she also, really helped the movement forward and helped get me the right to vote. So these women fought for my right, and so I felt linked to them by both gratitude and shame. And this is the 2020 election. These women haunted me. In her book, Caste, Isabel Wilkerson talks about how the U.S. never truly dealt with slavery's legacy. Whatever is lurking will fester, whether you choose to look or not. Germany was forced to reckon with the Holocaust. They paid reparations to survivors and incorporated the history into their school curriculums. In the U.S., teaching the history of racism remains controversial. This was really driven home for me when I moved from Western New York to Nebraska. At Western New York, I was at this all-girls school. It was an independent high school, and at the beginning of the pandemic, we did this thing where we made all these critical race theory resources that we shared in a presentation on Zoom. And then I got to Nebraska at a university, and we were just saying, "Oh no, we don't teach critical race theory here. That's not something we do." Which was just so bizarre to me, and so it was also something that I was thinking about as I wrote this introduction. The wound has festered, and old themes endure. This is January 6, 2021. The more research I did for this project, the more I saw how interconnected the struggles of all disenfranchised groups were. Francis Watkins Harper put it best in 1866. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. So, a little bit about the process here. Often pulling from a lot of visual references from the museums, from actually going to see the chapel where the Seneca Falls first women's rights convention, or arguably the first women's rights convention, was held. A little fun note on this. So this was the table where the Declaration of Sentiments, the first declaration asking for women to have the right to vote, that was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. That's the table where it was written. And it has this interesting history of also being a table where seances were hosted. And this is interesting, especially because there's this long overlap between suffrage and spiritualism, in part because spiritualism was a forum where women could speak in public. It was one of the first places where it wasn't very taboo, in part because they were channeling dead white guys. But I found that really fascinating. So there's a lot of suffragists who were also spiritualists, and they kind of came in side by side. The Civil War had just happened. A lot of people had passed away, so that has part of it too. I mean, not when she was writing the Declaration, but that's why the overlap of the popularity. And so spirits were just in the air as Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote that Declaration, and there are actually letters where she talks about feeling like she's channeling the spirits of the Revolution while she's sitting at this table. Which I just found really interesting because of the way that they had to have such radical imaginations to even imagine living in a world where they could vote. And that was really controversial and was almost left out of the Declaration. A lot of Lucretia Mott and some others believed that it was too much. Sure, women should have rights to guardianship of their own children, but I don't know that they need to vote. So it was interesting to me that they needed to have almost a magical belief in order to push forward. I was excited that I went to the Smithsonian the History Museum in the fall, and I got to see the table. And of course, the table, though, does not say that it was also used as a seance table, but I was still excited to see it. And then downstairs in the gift shop, they had my book. So it felt like a full circle moment, a little bit. But here's just a little bit, this is not me doing the research in live. This is a bunch of sources that I used. I'm a little bit more organized now, but you can see at the time I was taking all my notes on these little strips of paper that I would use as bookmarks. Really working section by section. So the first half of the project, it would go up online with a gallery every 2 weeks. So I would spend a week researching and then a week drawing in 3 or 4 page segments. And then as I got to the end of that half of the project, I realized it needed some longer sections. So I did work some longer narratives in that I mostly completed in Omaha. But just as an example of a source, this is from the Revolution, which was Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony's newspaper. This was the newspaper that really marked their move from universal suffrage and advocating for universal suffrage to prioritizing educated women's suffrage. And this happened after the Civil War. For a moment, black men, black women, white women were all working together trying to get equal rights for all. It was called the American Equal Rights Association. But in that Reconstruction era, the choice was made to prioritize the black male vote, which of course these people were facing extreme violence. It was maybe the right choice, it's hard to say, but as a result, the American Equal Rights Association disbanded, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were extremely upset, and so they separated from the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was Lucy Stone and her husband Henry Blackwell, to push and to continue to push for women's right to vote instead of saying we'll go second after black men get the vote. And so I was interested in that particular fissure. And also, of course, though, it's interesting to note that while the revolution may have had some racist ideas put forward, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton claiming that, suggesting rape and violence towards women from black men, and that's why they shouldn't have the right to vote before women had the right to vote. They also did other things, like they defended sex workers, they pushed for divorce. There are things to really respect about what they did at the same time as there are things to be critical of. And so that was a really big push of the project, how to be critical at the same time as I celebrate. Like, how do you do that? And one of the things that came up for me is thinking about the way history gets written. And the Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony actually wrote their own history, working with Matilda Jocelyn Gage. They wrote the history of women's suffrage. It was 3 volumes. And then the next generation finished an additional 2 volumes. And the hope was that by sharing their story, they could help the next generation fight, because this was such a long fight for the vote. But in the process, because they were the authors, even though they sent out and had people send in materials from all over the country, they definitely prioritized their own story. So here's Matilda Jocelyn Gage saying, "It seems to me that these books are primarily about the 2 of you." So there's a great book about the myth of Seneca Falls that kind of talks about the ways that Seneca Falls became the origin stories of the movement that I love. One thing that did happen is Sojourner Truth's speech was recorded in a slave dialect, a southern slave dialect, which she probably would not have spoken in because she was a native Dutch speaker. So they had reprinted it in the same way. It was originally published in the Anti-Slavery Bugle in that slave dialect, and then it was republished in their History of Women's Suffrage. And so Sojourner Truth spent a lot of time defending her image in the public, explaining that the older version was likely, the Dutch version was the right version and not the one that was being used to fight for against slavery. And then also later she had to deal with other misrepresentations of herself in the media. There was an article called The Libyan Sibyl that Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote. And she had spent her life in New York State, so she was pretty upset by it. Like, she wasn't from Africa, and she didn't call people honey. And so, but she was illiterate by choice, so she had to get people to help her write letters to the editor, which she did do. So I thought that was fascinating. And I also learned a lot about how the Mary Church Terrell picketed at the White House, which I thought was interesting. She wrote about it in her autobiography. She stood at the White House gate. She brought her daughter along, and she likely inspired other people to vote, but their names are lost to history. So I kept hearing that phrase, their names are lost to history, and I was like, well, what the heck does that mean exactly, right? So I have a short excerpt here I'll read. But what does it mean to be lost to history? There's Mary Church Terrell and her daughter picketing at the White House gates. Loss suggests passivity, but history is active. In 1921, Mary Church Terrell asked the NWP to pressure Congress to investigate the disenfranchisement of Black women across the South. No woman in this country needs the ballot more than the colored women of the South. History is made, written, edited. There is more than one to write. Terrell's words were not recorded in the stenographer's report and were left out of the published meeting minutes. They are victims of lynching, the conflict-linked system, the Jim Crow lines. Just as every choice erases possibility, each history written leaves behind casualties. The National Women's Party refused to help. Is it possible to write history that leaves room for their ghosts? Miss Paul did not want to inject the race problem into her suffrage work. That's NWP member Ella Murray. Goes to show us what could have been, could be, if our systems made it be. Alice Paul asked me, what do you women want me to do? There's Mary Church Terrell. Goes to suggest new systems, new ways of being. I said, I want you to tell us whether you endorse the enforcement of the 19th Amendment for all women. History that breathes, that lives, that creates possibility. Paul refused to help. She feared losing the ground many women had gained with the 19th Amendment. Universal suffrage didn't work for Aunt Susan. Why would it work for us? History that refuses to accept a broken system as the only system. Alice Paul had a chance to reject racism. What if she had taken it? And of course, I don't know the answer to that question. There's a chance that the 19th Amendment wouldn't have passed, and actually that's pretty likely. They would have had to fight for much longer. So what do we do with that? Maybe we don't know what we do with that, but it's useful to know. So the book is really thinking about what that unfair literacy testing, how that filters back through time. And so it includes a testimony of Fannie Lou Hamer talking about her fight to vote, and then her words, "Nobody's free until everybody's free," echo across time through in Anthony speaking opportunity, past the district jail where many women were imprisoned for their picketing for the right to vote after the war began, and then also through the Tennessee State Capitol, which was the state that was last to ratify the amendment. So that was the place where it was ratified. So the book talks about all of those moments in history. And then I also often try to show this work in public space because while comics aren't always that easy to read in the gallery space, I've had great conversations as a result of doing this. And so I try to activate the comics in a different way because it can be overwhelming to read that much material on the wall. So I created these banners, definitely taking some inspiration from that Judy Chicago dinner party I mentioned with the women facing each other and sort of in conversation, those banners in conversation. And then in the middle was Susan B. Anthony sort of tarrying with that fight for universal suffrage on her deathbed, because I think that Susan B. Anthony is somebody who did really battle with whether or not she should be pushing for educated suffrage or universal suffrage. As a Quaker, it was important to her to try to fight for all people, and it seems to be something that she struggled with throughout her life, like figuring out the right path forward. So here's a couple more pictures of those. And then I also created this big, long mural. I was calling it my panorama. I was thinking about those like cyclorama, old historical museums. It's a little smaller than that, but still big for me. And I made this after the book came out as a way to kind of celebrate various plot points and bring it to life in the gallery space. And then there's also a couple shelves for some of the mini comics that I made on the way to the larger project. And there it is for scale. This is in Omaha. And then just some, so you can see on the far right, that's Fannie Lou Hamer testifying before the Democratic National Convention about not being allowed to vote. And this was famously shut off so that Lyndon Johnson could memorialize the 9-month anniversary of Kennedy being shot. But that backfired. He didn't want it to be on because the elections were coming up and he thought it would make him look bad. But then backfired because they played it during prime time. And so Fannie Lou Hamer testified about her experience, bullets being shot at her window for trying to register to vote and attending a citizenship training, and the violence she faced after she was arrested at a rest stop that they tried to integrate. So her words echoing back their time, and then some other plot points represented, but you'll have to read the book to learn about them all. So now I'm going to turn to talking a little bit about some things I'm thinking about now for my next project. So first, I've been taking this medieval history class. I'm thinking about the visual representations of disaster. And as part of that, I'm taking a history class on the medieval other. It's a grad class at the University of Nebraska. And in doing research for that class, I came across this medieval manuscript that has all these pictures of what look like people making comics, right? And I was like, what is this? Why are they making comics? So it kind of sent me down a research rabbit hole. And one of the things I started to learn is that these grids were used as mnemonic devices in rhetoric education. So people would be instructed to embed memories or different parts of speeches they were going to deliver in different parts of these grids that were either just mental, but sometimes also on the page. And I learned that medieval manuscripts were often thought of as mnemonic devices, and the book itself was a mnemonic device. And the marginalia in the margins was also there to help you remember, because books were very they were rare, and so the idea was to try to embed your memory with these different illustrations. So there's a chance that something like this was actually used as a diagram to embed all kinds of memories, the way you've heard maybe about like how rooms were used to like memorize a speech. You could put like a word by the foyer and then like a few sentences in your bedroom, and imagine that experience of walking through the space, and then you can remember a lot more content than you could if you didn't do that. And so I thought it was really interesting that these devices were used and what they had to say about comics as a result. So for example, this is a canon table that would have been used by monks to meditate on biblical passages. And they would look at the table, and then they would remember the different colors of the columns, or they would remember the iconography at the top to represent the different books of the Bible. And I just think it's really interesting, especially this crossover between ancient Greek history and medieval history. So this would have been ecclesia, the church, the feminine embodiment of the church uniting kingdoms. But I also thought it had something to do with this other chart. This was made by a woman, actually, a nun named Herod van Landsberg. And this is the 7 liberal arts diagram. And you can see Philosophia in the middle, and then there's Socrates and Plato on the bottom. And I studied the liberal arts, so this was like a really well-known image in my head. I also found it interesting that the dark arts, like the magic arts, are on the bottom, and they have these little creatures on their shoulders. But again, a mnemonic device that could be embedded with different memories. The other that I think it's hilarious that grammar was taught with a whip, and this is how you always see grammatica represented with this whip. But then rhetorica has this tablet, so it's a wax tablet that you could write on, take notes, and then scrape. But because paper was rarer, you had to really memorize stuff, and your note-taking was more to get these memories in your head. And so my other thought is the grids that these people are using in this picture could be a type of wax tablet also. But regardless, I think it's definitely the case that the comic grid is imbued with this history. Comics are built to be remembered. And I'm thinking about what that means when it comes to stereotypes. So Jewish people are often drawn with these hats, which was at first just a signifier of their connection to like old knowledge. But as these images were spread, you start to see them used in more dramatic, terrible ways. So this is a depiction of hell, and you can see the Jews in the pot, and this, of course, led to actual violence that happened, and it's part of the problem and not the whole cause. But it became really important to me to start thinking through this, like what is the power, what is the responsibility that comes with the mnemonic strength of these pictures that we create? So another stereotype that I'm looking at is women eating their babies during famine. This is a depiction from an illuminated manuscript, and this was a story that people believed that God was causing the famine because women who were in the famine are like continuing the famine because women who were eating their babies. Similarly, there's depictions of these weather witches causing the rain that can sustain the famines. So I'm looking at those. I'm thinking about how they relate to now, with these lists of words that have been banned in grant applications. Lists of words that include women and gender diversity and Hispanic minority and all kinds of words that just, immigrants shouldn't be banned in this country. So I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about other visual representations of disaster. So the next book is going to be Imagining Disaster. This quote from Walter Benjamin is in my head: "To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up in a moment of danger." So I'm hoping I can seize hold of some of our cultural memories of disaster as disasters spread, as climate change picks up. I think it's going to be really important to think about how we relate to these representations of disaster. So I'm looking back in time, and this is Fanny Palmer. So she's somebody who I think will become a character in the story. Fanny Palmer is a Currier Knives artist who made lithographs for Currier Knives and did the original art for them. And this one in particular, I just had never really thought about the amount of wood that these riverboats burned, but this is wooding up on the Mississippi, and those stacks and stacks of trees would burn to fuel the riverboats. And entire forests were actually cleared in this process, which I find kind of fascinating. And the way that these are very idealized images, but they're also kind of disturbing celebrations of colonialism now that we look at them, right? So there's the indigenous folks on horseback with the smoke coming in their faces from the truck, from the train, and it says, across the continent, westward, the course of empire takes its way. And so they weren't even being quiet about it. Also looking at Carolyn Merchant's book, The Death of Nature, which discusses the ways that the scientific revolution really shifted the way we think about nature from being something that we needed to help protect to being something that we should exploit. So this quote, "The death of nature as a living organism helped accelerate the exploitation of both human and natural resources in the name of culture and progress." So hoping to consider this too. But basically this project has become this space for me to kind of reflect and use research as a way of coping with this historical moment. You know, the book, the Suffrage Songbook, ends on a very hopeful note, you know. This idea that history is like waking up, that we're reckoning with it, you know. And of course we're seeing the pushback from that. And so to actually have this moment when the book came out where I was like, yeah, Harris is gonna win, you know, to then have that taken away was extreme, and I'm sure you all felt it too. So this project has been a place to think about that. So here, I will be talking a little bit about working in the, doing the cemetery walk. So here's me as the Iroquois Theater fire victim. And this was some of the dramatic script that somebody wrote. I don't know who the author, Laurel probably knows. But I saw Anna fall, and people stepped right on top of her as they fought their ways to the exit doors. But these doors open inward. I still have this whole monologue memorized. It's kind of hilarious. But here are some other victims. I played a smallpox victim. I was the victim of a murder, a stepmother turned serial killer, and then there's the pioneer. I also love the Titanic. I was just fascinated with these things, and I think a lot of people are, right? Like we stare at the car crash. And then recently during the pandemic, I came across these postcards that depict disasters from history. So this was, you know, this was during the golden age of postcards, and these postcards were the cheapest way to communicate. And so these weren't just made for news. So this is the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. They were also used to raise money for the relief effort. So this is an earthquake in Messina, Italy. This is an official memorial card you would get for donating, and then they would also send you these postcards. But they were also used just so people could share an event they witnessed. So this is in Omaha, and it's the results of a tornado. And here's a packing company fire in Omaha. I liked all the hand-drawn details are so lovely and horrible. Oil well fires, which I also think are interesting, like burning money, these are very popular ones. And one of the things, as I started looking at the writing on the back, I wanted to know like how people were actually using these postcards when they sent them. And one of the things that I learned, or is seeming to come to the surface, is that a lot of men used them when they were being forced by the current climate to move across the country for new jobs. And so they were often sending them to loved ones to report on their joke about their safe arrival in the new place. Like, you know, I got here safe. Or they were like, they were sharing it as an opportunity. Like, I've got a ski team for us. This has been a trip of the life on the back of a postcard that shows the wreckage of the San Francisco earthquake, versus a lot of women were using them to like warn their families in their caretaking that somebody's health had declined. So I thought I would let you know that mama is worse. And I'm finding this over and over again. And I'm trying to get into some more archives and see if it holds up. But I think it's really interesting. So that's a lot of information that I'm not sure how is all going to settle quite yet, but the hope is just to use these disasters as a way to find connections on the sinking ship, to still my anxiety, and to hopefully share it with others and have them benefit from it as well. So thank you all so much, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Do you happen to know what was the last country to give women the right to vote and when it was?
I don't know this off the top of my head. Does anybody else?
Oops. I know Switzerland, 1979.
Switzerland?
1979.
Oh, wow.
One area.
I wonder what got you interested in this subject.
In suffrage and women's history? Well, I think it really was. I was teaching at an all-girls high school. I studied the classics, so I went for a great program, which was amazing, except for, we read two women the entire time. So I think maybe that was a lot more present for me than it might have been for other people, because they had more diverse curriculums probably than I did, but I saw that history and what that was like. And so then when I was in an all-girl environment, it became like really important to me to represent all these histories when I was teaching, because I was teaching art history and studio art. So we would go, just trying to find enough women to share in every different movement, and the challenge of that. So I think that's where it started. It was at the Buffalo Seminary in Buffalo, New York. Yeah, like a long independent, well, it was religious for many years, but it was a day in boarding school, and they had a long history. They started in like the late 1800s, so I actually found some folks who taught there who went on to protest at the White House gates, and there's a section in the book that actually talks about their lives. But the other thing is we sang every morning. We sang like Jerusalem and all these other songs, and so I had that communal singing experience that I think impacted this book too.
Since DEI is no longer part of curriculum, and as we know, that does include women, what are your feelings about the future for us as no longer being able to be included in curriculum?
Terrible, like pretty sad. I'm hoping that it shouldn't be on teachers to fight back against that, obviously. So I feel like a little bit more responsibility as somebody who has that freedom. I'm not teaching DEI as my content area. We're still in like the early stages of what feels like a Red Scare, right? So it freaks me out personally too, but I also realize that because I teach illustration, I'm not at as much of a risk. I don't think that, as women's studies programs might have to shutter, illustration won't. So I'm thinking about ways I can use that privilege that I have to like continue to make this work and to continue to bring voices to women and histories of people of color, and to celebrate that research. Like part of the project was really a celebration of all of the stuff I read. So there's a really long bibliography at the end pointing out these authors, and I hope I can continue to do that.
Has your book been banned anywhere yet?
Not to my knowledge, but maybe it'll happen soon.
How was it received in Nebraska?
People are generally very supportive that I've met face to face. The biggest pushback I've had, or some folks don't love that I gave Susan B. Anthony this moment of reflection on her deathbed, because we can't prove that she had it, which is fair, but it's been interesting to actually engage in a dialogue about something I made. I've never really had an opportunity on that scale. And then the other thing is just like, what about so-and-so? Like, I didn't include everybody. There's 36 people represented, but there's always someone that you left out.
The universal suffrage versus educated suffrage. Could you, especially educated suffrage, I never heard that term before. Could you define it better?
Sure, yeah. So universal suffrage was this idea that everyone should have the right to vote, regardless of their education. And educated suffrage was this idea that educated people should get to vote first. But of course, some people were systematically deprived of their education. So while like on the surface that sounds like, oh sure, you should be able to read, you should be able to write, you should know a little about American history in order to vote, sounds like an okay thing. But similar to like voter ID laws, was problematic for all kinds of reasons.
You had mentioned the Judy Chicago show, and I had not heard that term for a long time. The background behind that, I had heard, I'm glad that it's someplace now, because it was having a hard time finding Chicago didn't seem to have room for it. So I was wondering, do you know anything more about that, how it ended up in Washington, D.C.?
Oh, it's actually in Brooklyn. It's at the Brooklyn Museum.
Brooklyn. Oh.
I don't know the whole saga of that, but I know that I also had read that it was having a hard time finding a home. But yeah, the Brooklyn Museum has it now.
I noticed you very carefully maybe didn't use the term suffragette. And I've read things that's no longer, it's not considered a good term to use. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure, yeah. So suffragette was generally used as a pejorative a little bit in England against the most militant suffrage activists. So they were called suffragettes. They were the ones who were in prison that were throwing rocks through windows and things like that. And Alice Paul sort of famously spoke about why suffragists in the US didn't need to be so militant. Of course, she then decided they would be a little militant, and they would keep picketing at the White House gates even after the war began. And so then they were arrested, and they did go on hunger strikes. And they were called suffragettes in the media as a result of that. But at the same time, they talked about how they would talk about being like basically prisoners of the war because the government had unfairly arrested them for just freedom of speech. So I think that's the reason that using that term is not used. The idea is that suffragette is more radical, more militant than suffragist.
Your narrative is wonderful, but your artwork is spectacular. And I'm really taken with your Chagall-esque type of floating people and ghosts and all, and it's just wonderful. Could you talk more about your artistic background?
Oh, sure. Okay, so I did a lot of art in school. I was like in AP art at UPRF. I was always up in the art room and the slide room, just like that's where I like lived and made things. But then I went to school for great books where I couldn't really make art as part of the curriculum because everything was required and there just weren't really art classes. So I started taking classes at the community college while I was there, and then I was able to go to grad school right afterwards. So I went to grad school for visual studies. But I think in part because I don't have the bachelor's degree, I was never really forced to worry too much about certain types of like skilled drawing. Like I can teach it and I can do it, but I was able to kind of prioritize communication and sort of iconographic drawing over trying to get something look really realistic, and thinking more about design and how good design can save a bad drawing, you know. And I like showing the hand, and that's one of my favorite things about medieval art too, is it looks, it's like poorly drawn by a traditional standard, but I think as a result it's easier to read and you can process it faster, which I love.
I was curious how you got involved with the theatrical portion of your life in the cemeteries.
Oh, sure. I think Mrs. Dressel saw me in a 3rd grade production that was like a classroom thing in Mrs. Swanson's class at Lincoln, and asked me if I wanted to do the cemetery walk. And so that is how that happened. And then I just kept doing it.
Your work reminds me of the work of Grandma Moses.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I love Grandma Moses. Yeah, I mean, I think that it was more like I was making things, and then I started studying folk art, and I saw, and so then I maybe pushed it further that way, but I do love Grandma Moses. I love folk art. And for a long time, that was like, I would say that's my primary influence. Like, I want to make folk art that's critical of American history. And then I realized, of course, this style is used elsewhere, like in medieval art, so I'm trying to like expand that a little bit.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Caitlin.
Thank you for having me.